Hello and good evening, everyone. My name's James. I'm one of the editorial coordinators here at Boiler House Press, which is part of the UEA publishing project. Welcome to our virtual launch event for the first half of our Recovered Books series, What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge. As I speak, we're halfway through UK Disability History Month. Now, in its 12th year, UK Disability History Month aims to celebrate the lives of disabled people now and in the past, challenge disableism by exploring oppression over time and now, and achieve equality. Particular themes are highlighted each year, with this year's joint themes being disability and hidden impairments, and disability, sex and relationships. The history of disability provides us with a framework through which to view this new accessible edition of What Katy Did by Susan Coolidge and its continued relevance. Tonight, we will learn about the process of rediscovery, education, and redesign that has brought this forgotten children's classic back to bookshelves in such an exciting new format. The project has been undertaken by the Department of American Studies, revolving around modules led by UEA academics Hilary Emmett, Associate Professor in American Studies, and Tom Smith, Professor of American Literature and Culture, with the help of book designer Emily Benton. We'll also be hearing from two of the UEA students that worked on the project, Jessie and Madeleine Bracey. Madeleine is partially sighted and so was particularly interested in the ways in which our edition could be made more accessible to readers with visual impairment. Hilary, Tom, Emily, Jessie and Madeleine will be joined tonight by special guest Harriet Cooper, former lecturer in medical and health humanities and current lecturer in medical education at UEA. Before we kick things off, there's only one piece of housekeeping to attend to, which is that if you could all type any questions you have into the YouTube live comment section, I'll then be forwarding them on to our speakers. We hope this evening's introduction and subsequent conversation will spark your interest in this forgotten classic and the mission of the Recovered Books series. Both titles are now available to order on our website, www.boilerhouse.press. So without any further ado, that's enough from me. Over to you, Hilary and Tom.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be kicking off today's celebration of both a very special book and, I think, a very special project. Susan Coolidge's What Katy Did was first published in 1872. So, as well as a book launch, this is also something of a 150th birthday party for a book which has charmed generations of readers across the world, but has never quite received the same kind of critical attention as some of its contemporaries, particularly, for example, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. So that was one of our goals with this book. In bringing What Katy Did to a new generation of readers, we wanted to give it a fresh critical framing that would equip contemporary readers with a sense of this book's rich history and its potential meaning in the 21st century. And I will proudly assert that we succeeded in that goal, but you'll hear more about how and why very soon. But perhaps more importantly than that even, this book was also something of a glorious experiment. Back in the early days of the first lockdown, my co-editor, Hilary Emmett, and I had a shared fever dream that had nothing to do with COVID. We were about to launch a new module dedicated to the development of American children's literature across the 19th century. And at the heart of that module, we knew that we wanted to publish our very own book. But more than that, we wanted to collaborate with our students to make a book from start to finish in roughly 6 months. Now, this wasn't totally delusional. We both had experience running assessment exercises in other modules where we got students to write an introduction to an imaginary new edition of a classic book. So we knew that that part of things was possible. But we also knew that we needed other collaborators to bring the imaginary to life. Luckily, when we approached Nathan Hamilton at Boiler House Press with this madcap scheme worthy of Katy herself, we found an enthusiastic and supportive partner who immediately embraced what we were trying to achieve by making a book that would put flesh on the bones of the theoretical lessons that we were exploring in the seminar room. So, first of all, thank you, Nathan. We were equally lucky to find a kindred spirit in Emily Benton, the book's designer, who I'm thrilled to say you'll be hearing from very soon. Emily also went above and beyond to capture our communal vision for What Katy Did on the page, translating all of our dreams for the book into a beautiful reality that perfectly married our concerns for both aesthetics and accessibility. So enormous thanks to Emily too. Above all, of course, we were profoundly lucky in our inaugural group of student editors who grasped the task that we set them with both hands, and having to work together remotely, of course, because of the pandemic, truly made this book their own right from the start of the process. As you'll hear from Jessie and Madeleine, our brilliant student representatives, in every way imaginable, this edition of What Katy Did bears the imprint of their care, attention, and vision for this book and its renewed significance in the 21st century. So enormous thanks to all the student editors and particularly their representatives today. And finally, last but certainly not least, we were generously supported throughout this project by the School of Art, Media and American Studies at UEA, and both the Pedagogy and Employability Funds from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So deep thanks to everyone involved with that support as well. So with that, I am delighted to hand over to my co-editor, Hilary Emmett, who I would also like to thank for her partnership throughout this project. Here's to many more, Hilary. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm having a sort of 19th century sentimental moment as Tom's speaking, just tearing up a little bit, thinking about all the people that contributed along the way. So thanks, Tom, for that acknowledgement. Thank you for being an amazing co-teacher and yeah, co-editor and co-contributor to this project. And I think Tom's absolutely right to describe this as a somewhat madcap scheme, but somehow while homeschooling and kind of supporting our students and trying to keep our own sanity in place throughout the pandemic, we seem to have pulled this off. So thanks, Tom, and thanks to everyone involved. I'm not going to talk for very long, but I just wanted to offer a brief frame for the speakers who are going to come after me. By way of picking up an idea that's kind of circulated around this project for a long time, which is the idea of Katy as a much loved book or a beloved children's classic. And if you've seen some of the publicity around the book, we've certainly described it as a beloved children's text. And what has kind of compounded that and sort of contributed to this constellation of loving terms that circulate around this text has been the number of people on social media who've responded to our announcement that we've brought out a new edition of this book by saying, oh, I loved this book, but man, I haven't thought about that for ages. I loved it in my childhood, but I really haven't thought about it for a long time. And this absolutely chimed with one of the reasons that Tom and I chose it, which is that we wanted a book that had name recognition, but that had suffered from neglect, that hadn't had the love that we felt that it deserved in recent times from scholars or publishers. And finally, of course, both Tom and I genuinely love this book. It has a particularly special place for me. It was given to me by my mother. I had my mother's copy that had been given to her by her grandmother. And this copy is definitely going out to all my nieces. So there's going to be kind of 4 generations of women and girls in my family that have been given this book, introduced to this book, and I hope will love the book. But what became very clear early in the project, and I know this is something that I think Jessie is going to touch on, and Madeleine may touch on as well, is that when we had our first class where we placed Katy under literary analysis, this love was not shared universally or uncritically by the students. And in fact, many of them were a little aghast at the representation of Katy's accident as a punishment for her rambunctiousness, as a terrible price paid for her spirited rejections of traditional femininity, or her outrageous flights of imagination that so often resulted in domestic chaos. And I have to say, it was quite challenging to me to let go of my love, of my uncritical love for this novel, because of course they were right. There are so many ways in which this book is so timely for this moment, because it's so unsettling. And this is something that I know Harriet is going to speak to, and something that I absolutely want to flag, that this is a much loved book, but it's a troubling book. It's an unsettling book. And there's a lot going on that make it so timely. And so what I learned from that process of of stepping outside this love relationship that I had with this book was that I had to trust the students to come at the novel with what we might call critical care or careful criticality. And I know that both Jessie and Madeleine will speak about their different approaches to this question, But what really stood out for me was the way that the students not only read this text carefully, but demonstrated that care for a new generation of young readers. So they didn't shy away from those challenging aspects of the text, but approach them in ways that contextualize them for these readers, enriching our scholarly understanding. So, this was an academic exercise, this was a scholarly exercise, but more importantly, flagging moments that might become talking points for young readers, giving parents and carers some context for talking through difficult questions to do with gender and disability, to name just a few. And they had the best possible guide that they could have in this in our wonderful colleague, Michelle Coughlin, from the Department of English and American Studies at the University of Manchester, who, despite parenting two very young children through the pandemic, despite having her own pedagogical and scholarly projects to attend to, did not hesitate to act as the external reader on the draft introduction our students submitted this past Easter. Her commentary was erudite, generous, and encouraging, and incredibly helpful in identifying the common threads running throughout this piece of writing that was co-authored by 19 different students. We owe her a huge and heartfelt thanks. She's an exemplar of what often goes unremarked or devalued in our field, but is quite rightly deemed service. So a big thank you to Michelle, who, this project could not have happened and would not have had the unity that it had Michelle not stepped in. And then finally, I know Tom has already thanked Emily in incredibly heartfelt terms, but this book would not have been realized without Emily's vision, without Emily's patience, without Emily's care and love that she applied to this text, and the way in which she kind of took up her brief and went above and beyond every step of the way. So I'm going to hand to Emily to talk a bit about that process, but thank you again to everyone involved.
Hello, I don't know if everyone can see me now. Hopefully you can. Yes, you're saying yes. Okay, brilliant. Hi, my name's Emily Benton. I'm the book designer for What Katy Did. I'm going to share my screen with you now because there's just a few visuals that I think would be quite helpful for people to see. So we now currently have I'm currently holding one of the books in my hand. And this only arrived yesterday. So this is a very new, book on the table. So it's very exciting to be talking about it right now. So there are three things that I wanted to talk about in this very short presentation. They are typography, book format, and illustration. So they were the three sort of main avenues that I was looking closely at whilst designing this book for What Katy Did. So let's start with typography. Obviously, this is a key element of any book, is the type. So now one of the main concerns with What Katy Did, or with this text, was about making sure that the text, the design was readable, not just legible, but readable in its long form for people with accessibility issues, whether that be dyslexia or sight issues. And so during my research, there was a few things that came up that could accommodate or that could aid people in terms of accessibility. So I'll just quickly go through them because I think they are quite interesting. So space between paragraphs instead of indented paragraphs. So normally with a new paragraph, you would see a sort of a slight indent, and that would signify to the reader that it was a new thought or a new paragraph. But they were saying actually the indent can be quite confusing, or not confusing, but that perhaps a break between paragraphs is more helpful. So that was the first thing. The second thing is a sans serif typeface, which is a typeface like you're seeing now on the screen. So it's a typeface that doesn't have sort of the brackets. They're called serifs. So without that, it's less fiddly. So much better for people who are partially sighted, I think. Using a typeface that's a minimum of 12 points. So 12 points is actually quite large. In a normal book, you'd be looking at sort of perhaps between 8 to 11 points, something like that. So 12 point is almost unusually large. Then another thing is increased tracking. So tracking is a kind of typographical term where it's making sure that you have enough space between letters. So to make sure that the letters aren't too bunched up. And then the next thing would be increased leading, so that the space between the lines isn't bunched up as well, that you've got enough space between the lines. So essentially, with those two things, you're saying you want to give each character and each line enough space so that someone who has dyslexia or who has sight issues can sort of pick out each individual letter, and that they don't all sort of clump into one sort of mass, as it were. So the next thing is not to use underlining and not to use italics, because italics can sometimes create perhaps a sort of a strange sensation for people with dyslexia. But instead to use bold for emphasis. And the other thing is not using all caps. Caps tend to be kind of blocks of letters, and they all can look quite similar, whereas lower cases have ascenders and descenders, and which are the bits that go up and the bits that go down, and that can help us differentiate between those letters. So no all caps. And the other thing, which is also really interesting, is not using super bright white paper, which I really enjoy, not creamy paper anyway. So this was a great excuse for me to be able to specify using a slightly creamy paper, because I always enjoy that. And the other thing is to not use glossy paper. So a glossy paper will create a sort of a sheen or a shine, so that it detracts from being able to read the text. So staying away from glossy paper, staying away from bright white paper. And the other thing is to use text that is left aligned, which means the right hand edge of it is ragged. It's also called ragged right. So those are the things that I'd come across in my research for how to make sure that we were designing so that the most amount of people could see and could be part of the reading. So how can we ensure that partially sighted readers can enjoy this edition? So those were some of the things that we could employ. But are there any typefaces that cater for both partially sighted and dyslexic readers? They're two very different ideas. Dyslexia actually is, it's very different. And one of the typefaces that I came across for dyslexia is this one just here, and as you can see, it's quite a strange looking typeface. It's weighted at the bottom to prevent the dyslexic reader from sort of flipping. I think what happens is sometimes the letters get flipped in the brain and they turn upside down. So by weighting the letter at the bottom, it means that the brain finds it harder to flip than the other way. But as you can see, this typeface, it wouldn't necessarily work as a text typeface for everybody. It would work for some dyslexic people, but it might not work for everyone, and it probably wouldn't work for people who are partially sighted. So it's tricky to kind of get something that worked for everyone. But there was this typeface that I found called Atkinson Hyperlegible. Now this was it was designed for the Braille Institute in the US to be used for people with sight issues. So it was designed specifically with this in mind. So we sort of felt like we'd hit the jackpot here, especially as it's freely available to use by anybody. You can download it from their website. So if you feel like you have a project that might need a typeface like this, go and download it. It's free for you to use. And I'll just go into some of the really interesting ways in which this is more readable for most people, including people that don't have sight issues as well. As you'll see, the cap I, the lowercase I and the lowercase l all look quite different here. If I was to show you now Arial, which is a typeface that probably most of us have on our computer, the cap I, the lowercase I and the lowercase l are really similar, confusingly so. So I think it just highlights how we sometimes don't even realize how similar certain characters are in a typeset. So Atkinson Hyperlegible, it focuses on letter form distinction to increase character recognition and ultimately improving readability. And another thing I'll just quickly highlight is, if I go back up here, when blurred, an 8 and a B can look very similar. And so what they've done with Atkinson Hyperlegible is made the top bowl of the 8 a lot smaller, so that when blurred, it's easily distinguishable from the B, which if you were to do that with, say, Arial, it wouldn't be distinguishable. So I mentioned earlier on in this list, space between paragraphs instead of indented paragraphs. I'll just go through a couple of our experiments with this text and how we, a couple of the questions that came up, because it was quite interesting what happened. So it was saying, put space between paragraphs. The only thing is there's quite a bit of dialogue in what Katy did. So if we were to put a full line space, which I've highlighted here in blue, this is a full paragraph return. If we were to put a full line space between every paragraph, between the dialogue, that would end up causing the text to fracture and sort of to fall apart in a way, and it would end up making the book extremely long. It almost seemed unnecessary to have a full line space between every single paragraph. So we tried, do we have a full line space between longer paragraphs but have an indent between dialogue? We decided that that was probably quite confusing for the reader, and it wouldn't always be obvious why we'd done it, you know, this mixture of ways. So we ended up deciding to do a half line space between paragraphs. So we still get this feeling of space between lines, which makes it more readable. But we don't get things sort of falling apart and fracturing and sort of just, and the book becoming too long. The only thing with this half line space is, you'll see down the bottom here, we get this a slight differentiation in where the foot of the text at the foot of the page finishes, which ideally we'd like it to finish on the same line, so that when you turn the page, that all of the lines back up. So if you were to hold the page up to a lamp or a light, that every single line on both sides lined up. But with this type of setting, it doesn't line up. But there's pros and cons, and I think it's worthwhile going for this, even though they don't line up now at the bottom. So another thing was book format. So now we've got this idea of we want to use a large typeface. We have to decide what size book what size page do we want to set this large typeface onto. If we choose a small page, the text is going to look even larger. So just to give you an idea of some of the book formats, the common book formats, we've got here the sort of pocket penguin book. Here is A5. We've got a sort of US trade size here, Royal, which is the one we ended up using, which is why it's highlighted. And then all the way up here, we've got A4. So that gives you an idea of the context. So with our 11.5 size typeface on the US trade, on screen, this looks sort of not quite normal, but printed out, this text looked too big. It was sort of, it didn't look good, basically. So another way to make text look smaller is to set it on a larger page. So that's what we ended up doing, was using a slightly larger page size. Then we were able to use a larger text size, and it didn't look too large. So we were able to balance that out there. So that was a brief explanation about the format and how we came to the size of the book. So it is slightly larger than perhaps some paperbacks that we come across. In terms of illustration, Adi Ledyard produced the illustrations for the first edition. And so we briefly considered using those in our new edition. But it didn't quite sit well. It felt to sort of archaic and not quite current enough for this edition. And so I floated the idea of perhaps using found imagery. So in the 19th century, sort of when this book was written, photography was just sort of coming to the fore. It wasn't used by a lot of people because it was an expensive mode of image making. much more expensive probably than illustration was at the time, but it took long exposure time. So the subject matter of the images is normally very static, very still. It's portraiture, it's objects, and wasn't sort of very conducive to photographing the bustle of family life, which it sounds like Katy was very much involved with, and it would have been probably quite blurry images if we'd have managed to capture that. So additionally, the limitations posed by printing and binding methods at that time meant that very few publications contained photographic images like this. So it felt like only now can we sort of marry those up again. We can actually find images from the 19th century, and we can add them back into the text that was written in the 19th century, and bring those back together again. So managed to find some really beautiful images, and I went through the text and found just went through, and when I read that there were chickens, for example, I would go online and see if I could find a very, very old photograph of chickens, or, you know, this is the chair that Katy's dad sat in, and Katy, she hurt her spine, so managed to find an old X-ray. It was really fun actually trying to find images to go with this text. So I just thought I'd show here an example of an image I found of a school in the 19th century, and how this is how images have been used in our new edition, where we use an image at the beginning of a chapter just to sort of introduce the next section of text. And then I just thought I'd finally show you actually what the cover looks like, just in case you haven't seen it. That's the front cover and the spine, and it was basically wooden block type was quite popular at this point. So the cover was kind of based on this idea of using woodblock printing, and the layering of inks over the top of each other. So yeah, I think that's me, and I'm all done talking about the design process, and I hope that was interesting or helpful to people. And so now I think I'm passing on to a couple of the students, either Jessie or Madeleine. I think it's Jessie going first, so welcome, Jessie.
Hi there. Yeah, I just want to thank you, Emily, for all of your part of this as well. I was one of the student editors on the module, and I'm really happy to be able to have a little bit of a talk about my experience of it. As Hilary mentioned, some of us in the class had quite strong reactions to the novel, and I was a little bit familiar with it before, but I didn't know the book very well prior to the project. And I found myself having a really passionate response in terms of the nature of the attitudes, especially around disability and the ideas around femininity, which again, I think Hilary briefly mentioned. But I think in a way that gave us a lot more to get our teeth into critically. And I don't think I would have wanted to undertake this project with a book that I didn't have those feelings about, because it would have meant that the introduction felt less necessary in some way. And especially the idea of sort of an emotional and personal response not being necessarily that important in terms of like looking at something in a critical way, which I think as part of an undergraduate program was a really important thing to also think about. And the fact that it was still really interesting to work with the book despite having that reaction to it. And the other thing I would say is that was so engaging about taking this module, especially in the final year of our degrees, was the feeling of being something outside of just it being marked, it not being work that we were doing for our sake, but that was going to have a life outside of our degrees. And it was the practical realization of what could have been a theoretical exercise. Of, as both Hilary and Tom mentioned, they'd asked students to write introductions before, but they were, you know, not ever going to be published. And the chance to work with the faculty as well as kind of co-collaborators, as opposed to just students and teachers and having that separation, I think was a really lovely step in terms of moving us from students into graduates as well. And I'd also just love to say that it was really interesting working with within the publishing field as well. And I personally just loved the found imagery, which had this really like slightly unsettling quality. And I think, as Emily said, it married up really nicely the present and the past, showing the 19th century with the kind of 21st century sensibility, and how we see that time is through those photographs. It's not through the illustrations, it's how we, when we look back, think about it. And I think the idea of how the book is seen now versus how it was originally received was part of what my group wrote our part of the introduction on, in terms of reception. And the way that has transformed, I think, is again part of what for me makes the introduction feel so important and so worth looking at in terms of having critical context for the piece. I think Madeleine will be addressing this a little bit further, but our class was also really interested in the accessibility aspects. And I think that's especially important considering the context of the novel, because we wanted to show that some of the views on disability that you could read into the novel, and I definitely found myself at times reading into it, were not reflected by us. You know, we wanted this to be something that, you know, was accessible to those with disabilities, wasn't alienating, and was a story that centered a disabled narrative as well as being one that could at times have other subliminal messaging. Yeah, I think that's all I pretty much have to say today. So I think I'm passing over to Madeleine now.
Hello, hi. Yes, hi everyone. As James said at the beginning, my name is Madeleine Bracey, and I was another one of the students who worked on the book as part of the Little Women and Barefoot Boys module. Incidentally, I am also disabled. I have visual impairment, which meant that I was able to access a particular understanding of this book, and to experience the process of publishing what Katy did from the perspective of a partially sighted reader. With that in mind, today I'm going to talk just a little bit about the role disability came to have in this project, both in relation to its centrality to the text itself, and to the approach we took to publishing it. So the matter of accessibility came up quite early on. Naturally, I personally felt quite passionate that the publication I was working on should be one that I would feel able to not only access, but to enjoy. One of the key aims of the project as a whole was that this book should fulfill its role as an academic edition, but shouldn't lose its fundamental identity as a story for children. In the same way, I felt that it was important that we achieved the dual aims of creating a text which was approachable for disabled readers, but didn't in any way detract from the reader's enjoyment of the plot. What was very fortunate was that I wasn't alone in that sentiment, not by any means. In fact, a discussion about accessibility emerged very organically at an early stage in the project, and as a class, this became something that we came back to time and time again. So, as you know, what Katy did follows a girl coming to understand her own disability. As Jessie mentioned, the presentation of disability eventually became one of the themes that we picked out to discuss in our introduction. We looked at Katy's journey coming to terms with the limitations placed upon her, limitations that she wasn't used to, new limitations, and subsequently how she managed her feelings about her new status as a disabled person. In all, we as a cohort felt very strongly that disability should be highlighted in our scholarly reading of the book, and our audience should be encouraged to consider the relationship between ability and disability. The classes in which we worked on as the project became very supportive spaces for me personally, as I'm sure is the case for all of us here. You know, I'm a big reader. I do get a lot of pleasure from reading. So to be given the opportunity to share the difficulties I face when reading was really important for me, but also important for the project as a whole. Those opportunities are not very common for disabled readers. So I feel very confident that this book is better off having developed from that environment. Perhaps more importantly, it was important that my classmates and my colleagues were keen and able to develop responses to those difficulties and literally put them into print. You know, obviously Emily has spoken about the practical ways in which those difficulties were responded to. you know, for a publication of a story which is fundamentally about disability, to value the input of a disabled students, and for disabled readers, you know, so value that so highly, really sets this edition up to honour what the novel, you know, has always been, you know, a story about disabled person, but, you know, still consciously and decisively brings that novel into the 21st century, and makes it accessible to a 21st century audience. So I feel very honoured to have been able to contribute to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madeleine and Jessie. I was really moved by those contributions, and yeah, it's really moving and fascinating to hear about your work on this project. I hope everyone can hear me. Perhaps someone could just pop something in the chat so that, great, you can hear me. Yeah, so thank you so much to Hilary and Tom for inviting me to speak this evening. It's been a real pleasure to have had the opportunity to read this new edition of What Katy Did. And I'm really quite in awe of what the students have produced. And I encourage you to buy a copy of the book and find out. And I'm really intrigued by this edition as an innovative pedagogical activity as well. So it's really fascinating to me to hear the students emphasising, for example, the importance of the introduction as necessary due to the nature of the difficult representations in What Katy Did, and to hear from Madeleine about her experiences as a disabled student. And I'm going to have a few little reflections as a disability studies academic and somebody with a different sort of impairment, a mild physical impairment, and think a little bit about my own experiences of reading Katy as a child and also rereading Katy as an adult. But I firstly want to begin by focusing on editing as an understudied practice that informs how we read. And I think that's what this project really brings to the fore, because editing can quite often be really invisible work. It's often feminized work in academia, but it really shapes what we know and it curates what others come to know as important about a text. So it plays a really vital role. And so I'm really grateful to the students for highlighting that. And in this short talk, I want to think about how editorial work creates a context within which reading happens. And I want to argue that editing creates the conditions of possibility through which details become apparent or remain invisible. And that's really important when it comes to thinking about problematic text like What Katy Did and how to frame it for a 21st century readership. And I want to commend the work that the students have done alongside Tom and Hilary to make available certain context for reading in their really fascinating introduction. So I'm going to reflect on some of the things that the students have made visible in their editorial work before turning to my own childhood experience of reading Katy and what I was able to see or perhaps not see in the text back then, and how I feel about that today as a scholar of disability studies. So fascinatingly, one of the contemporary contexts that the student editors reflect on is lockdown. They draw attention to what it meant to them to read a book that takes us on a journey into domestic space during a period in which people were forced into their homes. In the course of the novel, the expansive narratorial focus contracts, homing in on the sick room and mirroring Katy's shift from being a free-roaming child to being schooled in the norms of adult femininity of the time. And the phenomenologist Iris Marion Young wrote this amazing essay in 1980 called On Throwing Like a Girl, where she explores the embodied experience of enacting femininity. And Young contends that the performance of femininity requires one to inhibit oneself and to prevent the blossoming of one's vigor and physical ability. So in this reading, femininity itself is a condition that then requires self-debilitation. And I think that's quite an interesting context too that we might think about in relation to Katy. So in returning for a moment to lockdown and to Katy's enforced domesticity, we might, I think, raise the question of who gets to stay at home during the pandemic and whether home is always a site of safety. And the students draw attention, for example, to the huge rise in cases of domestic violence during the pandemic. And they also rightly refer to the material dimensions of Katy's staying at home and what enables bed rest for Katy. They ask whose pain is allowed to matter. And they helpfully point out that, quote, the redemptive qualities of pain and suffering were often examined for white children and almost invariably girls, but no such meaning making existed for accounts of violence done to Black children at this time and the pain that they suffered. We can, in this context, I think, turn to Christina Sharp's 2016 book, In the Wake, which is about what it means to live in the aftermath of North American slavery. Sharp writes that, quote, medical professionals treat Black patients differently. Often they don't listen to the concerns of Black patients and their families. They ration palliative medicine or deny them access to it altogether. And she explains that research shows that people assume that Black people feel less pain than white people. Quite shocking, really. So a false and racist narrative endures even into the present day, not just about whose pain matters enough to be the subject of narrative, but also who is even imagined as the subject of pain. And in saying this, I of course have in mind another event that became news in 2020, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a policeman. And in that moment, racist brutality was fleetingly recognized around the world for what it was. But given that so many Black people die or are mistreated within institutional contexts, this then begs the question, against what cultural backdrop can racist brutality become visible as such? And I think, I feel as though it's really important to have these kinds of questions in mind when we read Katy in the 21st century, because it is a very white text, and we have to think about what's absent as well as what's present when we read. And the question of what has to remain invisible in order for a particular representation to appear is a really important one. And one of the reasons I really like this new edition so much is that it seeks to make visible aspects of text, context, and readership that might be at risk of slipping below the threshold of visibility. The students' editorial decisions are acts that have political import. By insisting, for example, on the hyperlegible typeface and on the inclusion of original found photographs from the 19th century, they remind us that reading is a practice that happens in a context enabled by particular technologies, whether those technologies are letters or images, coloured backgrounds, the reader's voice, reading glasses, screen readers, or e-reading platforms. They're all techniques that mediate access to the written word and give us insights into what it might mean. And an introduction to functions in that way. So these kinds of acts of making visible are deeply relevant to disability studies. The disability theorist Jasbir Puar critiques an identity-based model of disability, pointing out that in most Anglo-American disability studies, disability is seen as exception. So the exceptional, the child who has a disability is the exception. And Puar prefers the term debility, using it to point out how, at the level of the population, certain bodies are marked out for life, while others are designated for death or maiming, and they are debilitated in this concept. This argument should ring true for us at the moment in the current context of vaccine nationalism, where bodies in certain parts of the global south are debilitated by their lack of access to healthcare. And when we hear that the new strain of COVID probably emerged in the body of someone who had untreated HIV or AIDS and who didn't have access to vaccines, we can see what Puar means when she argues that the body that is recognised as disabled is one that has already been retrieved for rights, empowerment, and rehabilitation. The AIDS sufferer in the global south is anonymous, unknown, and does not get to be visible as a disabled person. And the ongoing invisibility of this figure has consequences in terms of how we think about bodies that are deserving of protection, of vaccines, and of convalescence. And so with all these thoughts about how the editors can make things visible, I want to come to the figure of the child reader and think about what the child reader sees. And of course, this is quite a speculative point, so I'm only going to speak for myself and for the child me. So a rather wonderful term that has really resonated for me as I've been thinking about this talk is, quote, the queer afterlives of childhood reading. And this is a term that Sarah Pike coins in her PhD thesis, in which she explored research participants' experiences of childhood reading. And she also researched what it was like for her participants to go back to classics that they had loved as children. In my own writing, I've been drawn to work on classic fiction that I read as a child, a bit like Hilary, I think. In my book, I wrote about my deep childhood attachment to The Secret Garden and my ambivalence about my former fondness for a text that sets up a hugely problematic ideal of colonial, able-bodied English masculinity. And I find it quite a vertiginous experience these days, thinking back to that little girl that I was in the 1980s, voraciously consuming classic texts that feature white middle-class disabled girls. I was really quite obsessed with these books, and they were really alive for me. I have memories of childhood games reenacting Little House on the Prairie and Anne of Green Gables with my friends. And as a young teenager, I was to break a bone in my foot when running barefoot down a dewy hill at a National Trust property, pretending to be Jennifer Ely's Elizabeth Bennet from the Pride and Prejudice TV adaptation in 1995. While Elizabeth doesn't break a bone in her foot, Marianne, in Sense and Sensibility, does sprain her ankle when running down hills in the rain and gets rescued by a man. Again, physical debilitation as part of the performance of femininity. So I guess what I mean to say here, with reference to my own rather literal dramatization of these literary moments of becoming woman, is how a certain kind of romanticization of Victorian girlhood got inside of me through this reading. The fantasy of both being ladylike and of defying such a norm was really alluring. I think it was what connected me with these fictional girls. It was part of the process of identification that allowed me into both their pleasure and their pain. To draw for a moment on Foucault's idea of the disciplinary society, and then the theory that the disciplinary society has now given way to a hyper-permissive control society, we could say that perhaps part of what was alluring was the notion of there being a discipline, a way of being a girl that one was supposed to emulate and that one could also rebel against. Because then in the 1980s, we didn't have to be ladylike, or at least not in that sort of way. And arguably, I think this act of readerly identification with the sentimentalized pain of the girl who tries to perform femininity, in that readerly identification, disability somehow disappears. It vanishes. I just explain what I mean. What I mean is that as a younger reader with a physical impairment, I very much saw, and I'm talking about, I was a 10-year-old, I think, 9-year-old, 10-year-old. I very much saw Katy's accident and its aftermath as the teachable moment that Coolidge set it up to be. And I thought it very romantic. So the disability theorists Snyder and Mitchell argue that the literary representation of disability is what they call a narrative prosthesis. So they mean this as a kind of disability as a crutch upon which a text relies in order for a narrative to unfold. And they call disability in this context an opportunistic metaphorical device. And I think that's a really useful framework here. The arrival of disability makes something happen. It makes a story unfold. But I would argue that in making something happen in the narrative, disability itself becomes kind of invisible, usurped here by femininity. And I think perhaps my disability was something I was trying to escape when reading. And I don't know that it ever really occurred to me that Katy was a story about disability, or that there could have been any sort of alignment between me and her via the experience of disability. This is also a way of saying that I did not, at that time in my life, identify with disability. Disability was not a category that spoke to me, and that was only later that I started to identify with that category. So I suppose what I want to celebrate in editorial work in general, and in the students' work on this edition of Katy in particular, is the importance of bringing these aspects of culture into view, the disability which might otherwise disappear. This edition brings questions of race and disability into view as contexts that matter. And hopefully the child reader of today would not find themselves splitting disability off as I did, and would instead be curious about the text use of disability as a device that disciplines Katy. I certainly think that this new edition of Katy will really help with that work. So thanks very much, and I hope you'll buy the book.
Thank you so much, Harriet, for that, incredibly generous and careful reading of our students' introduction. And I think you've absolutely nailed the work that they did, and the really tough questions that they asked of us, and that they asked of the book, and the way they're able to shape that into an introduction that we really hope is meaningful for contemporary readers. So yeah, we've had a couple of questions in the chat, including one for Madeleine and Jessie, and our own our wonderful colleague Becky Fraser, who is a historian of the 19th century herself, has asked Jessie and Madeleine, she's wondering how influential modern fictional texts were in writing the introduction. So whether you read Jacqueline Wilson's Katy, or whether your reading of more contemporary fiction changed or helped the way that you guys were able to contribute to the introduction.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. So in terms of Jacqueline Wilson's Katy, actually, that was my first experience, was the CBBC production of her, but the adaptation, which I watched with the children I used to look after. So I think that being my first introduction to this, and then reading the original, was two very different interpretations, because the portrayal of disability in that sort of, and having read what Jacqueline Wilson said about her rewrite, a lot of what she wanted to deal with was the way disability was addressed. And so when then reading the original, it was like, gosh, this is incredibly different. And I think, and in our section of the introduction, we looked a little bit at about that, and about the fact that the reception nowadays has got that element of sort of slight shock of people being like, oh, that's not what we think of it. And I think taking it and recreating that storyline for a modern day audience is a really interesting way to do it. But then also the other thing that came up in my readings about it was the fact that when Katy was first released, it was thought she was this incredibly rebellious, adventurous, like she was doing everything that you wouldn't imagine. And to some modern day readers, she doesn't seem that exciting if you've got like Hermione Granger or Katniss Everdeen, like the big, young adult fiction stuff. And I think all of those things definitely came together to look at the way it's been received now, as opposed to how it was originally. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jessie. That's a really great insight into, I guess, the readerly context that our students were coming from in reading some of these texts. And I just wanted to say, Harriet, I was glad that Anne of Green Gables got a shout out. And I know people can't tell, but my scarf actually has the text of Anne of Green Gables printed on it, and I wore it especially for this launch, because that is probably the text. I loved Katy, but yeah, Anne of Green Gables is probably the text that I love the most, and I have certainly acted out and yeah, had a lot of sort of emotional investment in. And I think so. Another question that was posed to Tom and me a little while ago was a question about the why has what Katy did actually kind of fallen into a bit of neglect. And what's kind of interesting about that is that it's very popular in the Commonwealth. So British readers tend to have read it, certainly of a certain generation. And Australian and New Zealand readers have come across it. It was certainly a very big feature in my childhood and the childhood of my contemporaries. But Americans don't seem to have loved it. And this is a question that we've been thinking through for a while, actually, through the introduction. And the students, I think, we're able to find some material on why it was enjoyed outside of America, why it was so popular outside of America. And part of that was because there's a certain freedom that was associated with Americanness, a sort of freedom that was associated with the New World childhood that certainly wasn't in place in the UK. And there are some comparisons, I think, in the introduction between this text and some other Victorian British texts at the time that certainly didn't in any way allow for the kind of tomboyish behaviour that Katy demonstrates. But yeah, one of the things that Tom and I have been thinking about is, but it seems to have been overshadowed by Little Women. And even as there's been kind of the one remix of Katy, we think it's absolutely right for the kind of treatment that Little Women has had with the Greta Gerwig film recently. And also Bethany Morrow's wonderful Little Women remix, which has come out recently, which rethinks, just to pick up on your point, Harriet, about the way we've tried to ask our readers to think about what experience was like for Black children in the latter half of the 19th century. Bethany Morrow's text has reimagined what Little Women might have been like for African-American sisters during the Civil War and its aftermath. And it's a really, it's an absolutely compelling read, which in revising that story, lays bare some of the very different challenges faced by young African-American women in the 1860s. So I can also encourage people to get hold of that and to think about all the ways in which contemporary readings of these stories allow us further insight into, Harriet, again, I think what you've spoken to really compellingly about the afterlife of enslavement, and turn new eyes on that period of the 19th century as it moved into Reconstruction. So
I'd just like to say thank you as well to everyone who's contributed today. Harriet, that was really wonderful to hear your response to this work and to the students engaging with it. It was great to hear from Jessie and Madeleine, and to see you both again. And also, I think as we run out of time, I just think it's worth ending with a nod to the future as well. And hopefully this time next year we will be here, same time, same channel, and we'll be introducing you to our new edition of Margaret Sidney's Five Little Peppers. So that's a kind of teaser trailer for what should hopefully be happening over the next year. So yeah, I hope to see you again in 1 year's time for that. Thank you, everybody.
And thanks to you all. I'll just step back in here just to give a little outro. Wasn't that such a treat? Thanks, everybody. Thanks to you all for making the effort to attend. I hope you've really enjoyed tonight's event as much as I did. And thanks to our panel. That's Tom, Hilary, Emily, Jessie, Madeleine, and Harriet for sharing their thoughts about what Katy did. I, for one, will be downloading the Atkinson hyperlegible font straight away, and also looking at the work of Snyder and Mitchell, the disability theorists. They sound fascinating. So as a quick reminder, What Katy Did is now available to order on our website, which is www.boilerhouse.press. We've also got another launch event coming up at 6 p.m. GMT on Thursday, 2nd of December, so that's this Thursday, for our second book in the recovered books title, which is Gentlemen Overboard. So I hope to see some of you there. All that's left to say is thanks again and all the very best, and What Katy Did will make a perfect Christmas present. So thanks very much indeed, and good night.